Okay, so this week we're going to move on to the next major event in our big picture Old Testament Bible study, the Exodus. Last week we talked about the bondage and slavery in Egypt, and even though there's not a lot said in the Bible about that time, it really just kind of covers the very beginning of the chapter of Exodus, about Moses' early life and how he was delivered from Pharaoh as a baby and grew up in Pharaoh's house, and eventually he may have been a military leader or commander, may have led the Egyptians to victories against Ethiopia, but ultimately he fell into his own problems when he murdered an Egyptian and was kind of found out by one of his own people who made it known and had to flee the country and met with God and went over to Midian, found a wife there, had a couple kids, and God sent him back to Pharaoh. And so he went to Midian, got a wife, got a mission, and then he got a partner too, because remember all the objections that Moses had, and God sent him Aaron, his own brother, to be a partner with him to go back, and so he wouldn't have to face Pharaoh alone. And going back to Egypt for Moses was it was a big deal. I mean, as we all would feel intimidated being sent somewhere, possibly back to the people we used to run with. If you get saved and grow as a Christian, if God sent you back to the people that you used to party with or that you used to hang out with before you knew the Lord, it could be really intimidating. Just like Moses said, like they're not going to believe me. They're going to mock me. They're going to say, "Oh, you don't know God. God didn't speak to you, and now it's all in your head." Moses faced the same things that we can face in our own lives, and that's just a quick summary of what we covered last week. But moving on, Moses is going back into Egypt. And God didn't send him alone. He sent him with Aaron, and he sent him along with all the elders of Israel. Originally, God just told Moses, just go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. And Moses objected, and so God kind of relented a little bit and said, okay, well, go to the elders of Israel first and tell them the message, and the elders will go with you. So Moses shows up with the elders and Aaron when he goes to Pharaoh. So his mission, confront Pharaoh, and it's in Exodus 5:1 we have Moses' first appearance before Pharaoh. So Exodus 5:1, and afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness. So Moses is speaking like literally first person for the Lord. He's saying, let my people go. Moses didn't come there and say, let us go. Let us, the Hebrew people, go. He's actually speaking like with God's voice directly to Pharaoh, saying, let my people go. And so this is God's demand. It's God's people, not Pharaoh's. Pharaoh believed like he owned them, like they were slaves. And God's making it clear through Moses, these are my people. They're not your people. They're not slaves. You need to let my people go. And we read that it said, let my people go that we may have a feast unto the Lord in the wilderness. And just like kind of brainstorming a little bit, this was before the law. This was before the feast days and stuff were instituted. So I was thinking, like, what feast would that be? Well, depending on how things went with Pharaoh in Egypt, obviously we know that things went bad. Pharaoh didn't listen to Moses and rejected the demand to let the people go, and God had to send him all kinds of plagues and had to deliver the people with a strong display of power. But you remember the feast that happened right before they left Egypt. Right? They had to celebrate a feast, and it was part of the last plague, the 10th plague, where they had to sacrifice a lamb and put the blood on the doorpost, right? It was the Feast of Passover. There was no Passover before this. This was the first time that they celebrated Passover. It's interesting that they have this feast as they're leaving Egypt, but yet before all that happens, Moses is saying, let my people go that they can celebrate a feast in the wilderness. What if it was God's original plan? Because God gives us free will. But what if Pharaoh had a free will and he could have listened to Moses and said, okay, I'll believe you. And if Moses did the signs and the staff and the hand with the leprosy and the water to blood, just like the little demonstration, maybe Pharaoh would have been like, what, these people take up a lot of space, and maybe it would be good just to let them go. And what if God had actually made provision so if Pharaoh would have gone that way of his own free will, they would have been able just to leave peacefully and then still have that feast of Passover, maybe in a little bit of a different way. It wouldn't be with the middle of with the 10th plague, with the death of the firstborn. Maybe God would have just instituted in some other demonstration that still could have been a picture, because we know the Passover is like a picture of Christ, who was our Passover, who was sacrificed for us, so that our lives could be spared. So possibly God would have instituted it in a different way. So, but that's just, and I'm not saying that's doctrine, but it's just kind of fun to brainstorm a little bit, because Moses said, let my people go so they can have a feast. And there were no feasts. There were no feasts instituted at this time. So maybe God had the Passover in mind, and depending how things went with Pharaoh, maybe they could have peacefully left and served God and had this feast of Passover. But those are just some thoughts of what could have been possible. So to hold a feast. And just a quick note that when Moses, we talked about how he may have had military training, may have been some sort of a leader. Moses and Aaron, they came in before Pharaoh and faced him on equal footing. Normally somebody who came in before Pharaoh, they'd have to do a fair share of groveling, and they'd have to use honorifics and, oh, Pharaoh, most high, God of all, hear our petition. That there was a lot of respect, and if not, the Pharaoh would just, be, off with their head. But Moses and Aaron marched in there, apparently had the authority to confront Pharaoh. I don't think the average Hebrew could have just came in off the street and said, I need to see Pharaoh. I'm on a mission from God, and I have a message for Pharaoh. But there was no problem with Moses and Aaron actually getting in and getting an audience with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh speaks to them as equals too. He never criticizes them. He never tells them to grovel. He never condemns them. And even though they came with a message saying, let my people go, if just some average Hebrew off the street came in and confronted Pharaoh with that, I would think it would almost be a certain thing. Pharaoh would just be like, who is this guy? Just cut off his head or something. Feed him to crocodiles. But he didn't do that with Moses and Aaron. So there was some sort of a respect there. Yeah, he could be. Yeah, something he had, even though he had left and came back, he may have still had the respect of the people. Maybe some of the Egyptian military still had some respect for him or something. But it's just interesting that he didn't just say kill him. There was some sort of a something hindered him from just executing him on the spot. And during this first meeting, I think it's interesting that Moses and Aaron, they didn't do the signs. Remember when Moses was protesting on the mountain, saying I can't do this. I'm not going to know what to say. I don't have all the answers. They're not going to believe me. They're going to say you haven't seen God. I can't speak well. God actually gave him those three signs: to throw the staff on the ground and become the serpent, to put his hand in his robe and pull it out and be leprous, and then to pour out water and have it become blood. But during this first meeting, they just go into Pharaoh and they say, let my people go to have a feast. And there's nothing about the signs. They don't do them. I'm just kind of wondering, why? Why hesitate? Were they maybe nervous? The signs weren't going to work or something? Maybe some doubts? They saw that the signs worked when he did them in front of the Israelites. Let's try to look at my little notes here. They're so tiny. So anyway, they didn't do the signs, and Moses doesn't, or Pharaoh doesn't respond well. Let me go back to my. There we go. So I'm wondering if it was an incomplete message. They just told Pharaoh, let my people go to celebrate a feast in the wilderness, right? But look at what God told Moses to say. When God met with Moses, this is the message that God gave Moses to say in Exodus 4. And the Lord said unto Moses, when thou goest to return into Egypt, see that thou do all these wonders before Pharaoh. That was the serpent and the leprosy and the blood. God gave him the signs. And God's saying, do those signs before Pharaoh, which I have put in thine hand, but I will harden his heart, that he shall not let the people go. And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, here's the message, thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn, and I say unto thee, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn. A little bit of a harsher message than what Moses just gave Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron walked in there, and they're just like, let my people go, that they can go have a feast. They didn't give him this whole message. They didn't tell him, like, these are my people. This is my son, my firstborn. If you don't let my people go, I'll kill your firstborn. Moses kind of gave him a very, maybe a weak message. Just, let my people go so that we can hold a celebration to God. So, kind of wonder a little bit, was he afraid? Was he maybe doubting God would come through? But it's a partial message, and I think it's an example for us. Like, don't hold back on the message. Our message in this dispensation is to share the gospel, to tell people that they're lost, that there is eternal punishment, that there is hell, that there is a way that you can be saved through the blood of Christ and believing in his atoning death. But I think sometimes people get nervous. People don't want to talk about hell. A lot of churches just leave that right out, or they just want to try to say hell isn't a torturous, fiery place. It's just a separation from God. They try to sugarcoat it and make it sound like it's not real scary, and it's an incomplete message. And that's what Pharaoh got here. He didn't get this whole message, and he responded very angry, and he came back and was aggressive. Where we need to give the whole message to people and not be afraid of parts that may not seem very palatable, that might seem kind of more aggressive. Sometimes it's hard to say to people, like, there's a hell and you're going to go to it if you don't repent. That's offensive. Somebody could be like, what? Me? I don't think so. I'm a good person. Maybe if they get the whole message, then the Holy Spirit can work in them and convict them of it. Pharaoh didn't get the whole message. Maybe that's why he was so quick to be angry and reject their message. Just so much of the world is into this like feel-good stuff. Just accept Jesus, just believe in Jesus. He'll make your life better. He'll fill a need that you have in your life. It just gets watered down because we don't want to offend people. And I always wonder if this is kind of like what happened here. They didn't want to just walk up. Talk about going to the leader of the most powerful country in the world and saying, if you don't do this, your son's going to die, right? That's pretty offensive. It's pretty aggressive. I almost wonder if Moses and Aaron were just a little bit hesitant to just drop that huge bomb, like right on Pharaoh. And they just wanted to maybe kind of ease into it, just say, well, we just want to go and celebrate a feast. But
so didn't God tell them right there in that passage we just showed that he was going to harden his heart?
He will. But I'll get.
He told Moses that.
He told Moses that he was.
I wonder if he put that in mind. Moses thinking like it doesn't matter if I show him anything. Like God's gonna do that,
right.
That was the
But I think as we get more into it, we'll see that I think there's free will involved, and then God moves in, and then God does the hardening. So, give people the whole gospel. Not just a feel good, just believe. Or even a wrong message where some people are preaching that there's some sort of works involved in salvation. Partial messages kill. They gave Pharaoh a partial message and it didn't go well for them. We got Pharaoh there. So Pharaoh didn't respond well, and maybe they didn't expect this response. Let me get the scripture up here. I think I've got it. There we go. And Pharaoh said in Exodus 5:2, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." So, kind of a sad commentary that there could be 2 to 3 million Jews or Hebrews living in the middle of Egypt for 400 years, and Pharaoh doesn't know who their God is. I mean, kind of sad. I mean, it doesn't say much for the Hebrews' testimony, for their faith. I mean, you'd think that there'd at least be some sort of an acknowledgement, like, oh, I don't believe in that God. He doesn't help them. They believe in him, but they're slaves. I'm not going to believe in them. Pharaoh just says, I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know the Lord. I don't know this God you're talking about. Kind of a challenge to us, to the people around us. No, if somebody was to refer to us, if we weren't around, would they and say, oh yeah, that Sean's a Christian, he does such and such, with the people that I work with, and be like, what, really? Oh, I don't know that, or would they be like, oh yeah, I can see that. Just kind of a challenge for us. The Hebrews apparently didn't have a very strong testimony of having a strong faith. So Pharaoh denies their request, and then I don't know. This whole first meeting with Pharaoh didn't go really well because it's almost like Moses and Aaron get sidetracked. Pharaoh, just flat out refuses. I don't know God. I'm not letting them go. And then Moses and Aaron say, and they said, the God of the Hebrews hath met with us. Let us go, we pray thee, 3 days' journey into the desert, and sacrifice unto the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. I mean, we're getting farther and farther from what the original message was. Let my people go, or your son's going to die. And now they're softening their message even more. He's saying, please, Moses is like, please let us go. 3 days journey into the desert, and he says, if they don't, God will punish them. I mean, the message was to Pharaoh that God's going to punish you if you don't let God's people go. And yet now they're like even getting more weaker, just saying, please let us go, or else God's going to punish us and fall upon us with pestilence. Like, I don't know, like that was nowhere in the conversations between God and Moses. God didn't say anything to Moses about, like, if you don't leave Egypt by this date and come to celebrate, I'm going to punish you. So they almost kind of like weaken their stance a little bit. And sometimes, it's intimidating. It's hard to be strong with people, but sometimes people need a strong voice. Sometimes, even like if you're witnessing, we can be nervous and come across as timid, and sometimes that'll really put people off. Sometimes people need a strong voice. They need a confident voice to say, look, this is what it is. There is a hell. There is an eternity. You're going to spend eternity in one place or another, and it's up to you to make that decision. Instead of just being this wishy-washy, like, you got a God-shaped hole in your heart and your life can be better. You just need to believe in Jesus. I think that's a danger. That's a problem in our society today. We need to give them the whole message, even the parts that are aggressive and strong.
Do you think that they were, with that last one, do you think that they were possibly letting them know our God is harsh, by saying he couldn't do that to us, but when you hear that, like, just want to kind of let you know, like, pestilence, sword, it'll happen to us. So
yeah, I don't see what kind of motivation that would be to Pharaoh.
Pharaoh wants that to happen.
I mean,
but like, doesn't it kind of like say, like, how do I tell these people that God's gonna kill them?
Kind of like maybe reverse psychology on Pharaoh or something,
or
maybe.
What if it was referring to like them not keeping the Passover and like God punishing them?
Well, they didn't have a Passover yet. It hadn't been.
That way he was like
it hadn't been instituted.
Didn't he say for 3 days to?
Well, I don't even see that wasn't even in the conversations with God. God didn't tell Moses, you need to go out for 3 days and have a celebration.
Well, like remember when Moses was on his way to Egypt and God sought to kill him?
Yeah.
Because the sons were circumcised, so he saw like the seriousness of God.
Yeah.
So maybe he thought like, if I don't do this, these
Yeah, it could be,
sacrifices,
yeah.
like God's gonna destroy us, like he
Yeah.
was about to destroy me,
Yeah, maybe it
because
could
my
be,
sons
Yeah.
weren't circumcised,
could be in the back of his mind, like, oh, this better work or else we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah,
You know?
that's
more like
true.
fear,
Yeah, it could be. So they come back with this kind of a weak response, and Pharaoh then kind of takes advantage of that, of the situation, and he takes control. And Moses, or Pharaoh, then gets angry, and he's like, the only reason you're here and not working, the only reason you want to go worship your God is because you're idle. You're not working. You're not being busy. That's why you want to go and worship your God and have this sacrifice and celebration to God. You're idle. Like he even he mocks him. He starts calling him that even later on with other confrontations. It's like you're idle. You're idle. Like you don't have anything to do, so you want to go and celebrate for your God. And I almost wonder if that's a picture of like Christianity today sometimes, where people only want to serve God where it's convenient. Does the world see that in us? Do we only go to church when it's convenient? Do we only read when it's convenient? Do we only pray when it's convenient? And that's kind of what Pharaoh was accusing them of, just saying, well, you guys must have a lot of spare time in your hands. You want to go and do something for your God. Well, if you got so much spare time in your hands, I'm going to double your work. I'm going to increase the work. I'm going to increase the load. And he just kept calling them idle. You're idle, and put them under hard bondage. And he increased their labor that they had to do. They had to make bricks, and it used to be that the Egyptians would like cart in the straw, and then the Hebrews would mix it up and add the straw to the mud and stuff and make the bricks. But then Pharaoh said, you know what, no more straw. You got to get the straw yourselves, but you can't decrease the amount of bricks you're making. You need to keep it up just as much as before, and they couldn't. And the Egypt there was Hebrews that were like taskmasters over other Hebrews. So it wasn't just all Egyptians that were overseeing the slavery. They even had Israelites working with the Egyptians to kind of oversee like their own groups of people, like a little hierarchy. And they were beaten. Egypt, the Pharaoh had the Israelite overseers beaten. And I don't know if I have the scripture here. Yeah, it was kind of interesting because Pharaoh has the Israelite overseers beaten, and they complain. They go to Pharaoh, and they say in Exodus 5:15, then the officers of the children of Israel came and cried unto Pharaoh, saying, wherefore dealest thou thus with thy servants? I mean, here you've got the children of Israel, Moses sent to deliver them. They originally received the message. Moses came in with Aaron and did the signs, and they all believed God was going to deliver them. But now that the bondage comes, the Israelites are like, they're telling Pharaoh, like, why are you treating your servants like this? Like, they're so in the world and so used to serving, they don't even realize that they're God's people. That they don't even realize that they have a different destiny, and that if they can just have faith, they can have their lives changed and get out of this bondage. But they're actually complaining to Pharaoh, and then it kind of backfires on Moses, because then they go back to Moses and they're blaming Moses, like, oh, it's your fault. Why'd you make us to stink in the eyes of Pharaoh? And so Moses ended up taking the blame.
Say Moses' point.
Moses' blame. Oh man, I've been busy. I'm supposed to say Moses. Wow, I'm back.
I was waiting to see how that was
I'm
gonna
back.
tie in.
I'm back a few dispensations there. But anyway, sorry about that. So I kind of see this first thing with Pharaoh, this first encounter with Pharaoh. We see that he responds very negatively. He flat out says, "I don't know God. I don't believe in him. I have nothing to do with him. And I'm not going to listen to you." And I'll comment more on that in just a little bit. Because I think Pharaoh may have missed his chance here. Because God gives us free will. And sometimes people want to point at this story and say, like, oh, how did Pharaoh, how is it fair for Pharaoh if, God just hardened his heart? Well, during this first meeting, it doesn't say God hardened his heart. I think this first meeting was Pharaoh's chance of his own free will to accept Moses' demands and let the people go. But he flat out denied it and refused God and said, I don't know God. I have nothing to do with him. I'm not going to respond and allow you to go. And I think that was like his chance for the free will to do right. And then when you see the future encounters with Pharaoh, that's when it says God hardened his heart. So once somebody has a chance, God's not under any obligations to give you chance after chance after chance. There comes a point where somebody rejects God long enough, and I think God can just say, you know what, they're done. They're never going to accept me, so now they're just my tool. I'm going to harden his heart, and I'm going to get glory in that way then. So Moses goes back to God, and he goes back to God humbly. He goes back with questions. He doesn't go like shaking a fist at God saying, how could you send me there? They were mean to me, and all my complaints, if you only would have listened to me, everything I said came true. I wasn't able to say everything I needed to say, and they didn't believe me. Instead, he goes back to God, and he's just, why? Why were we treated so harshly? Why did you even send me? Why didn't you deliver us? He just he goes back questioning and humble, but not angry at God. So then God responds, and in Exodus 6, I think this is where you see the difference between the free will of Pharaoh and the sovereignty of God, because in Exodus 6, it says, then the Lord said unto Moses, now shalt thou see what I will do to Pharaoh. So I think before it was almost like he couldn't deal with Pharaoh because he had to give him a chance of his own free will. But now Pharaoh rejected it. God's done with him. Now shalt thou see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand shall he let them go, and with a strong hand shall he drive them out of his land. So I think Pharaoh had to reject God first. God gave him a chance, and now in the subsequent meetings with Pharaoh, you see that God hardens his heart. It seems like in the scriptures, God, he's very patient. He waits until the last moment when there's not any more possibility for good to occur. Like with the flood, God could have eliminated humanity when there's a lot fewer people before the whole world got completely evil. But by the time we got to Noah, the whole world had been evil. It said that every thought of man's heart was evil continuously. Like the whole world was bad except for one man. Noah found grace in the sight of God. So God waited right to the end and then brought judgment. And then there's a verse in Genesis 15:16 about the Amorites when God was moving Abraham around and starting to build up the nation of Israel. He didn't want to lead them into the land of Canaan yet. And it says because the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. It's like they hadn't gotten evil enough. Like they still had a chance. There was still some good in them. There still was a chance for them to repent. But God knew that they wouldn't, and eventually they would have to be eliminated. When the Jews did come out of Egypt and go through the wilderness and went into the promised land, they were to execute them all, because at that point the iniquity was full, that their chances were gone. They were fully given over to evil and idolatry and wickedness and child sacrifice and all the polytheism and stuff that was going on in the land of Canaan before the Jews got there. So God likes to wait, and he's very patient, but there's a point where he's just like, no more. When you cross that line, you're done, and then God he can have his will with you. So God sent them back, told them to go back to Pharaoh, and they were real discouraged. It's almost like God gave them a little pep talk. In Exodus 6:13, it says that God gave them a charge concerning Pharaoh and the children of Israel. It's almost like God he gave them like a little encouragement and gave them a responsibility to go back. And so they were encouraged and went back to see Pharaoh. So we have the second appearance before Pharaoh. So in Exodus 7, we got, and Moses and Aaron went in unto Pharaoh, and they did so as the Lord had commanded. And now it's as the Lord commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh, and it became and before his servants, and became a serpent. And the Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, now the magicians of Egypt. They also did in like manner with their enchantments, For they cast down every man his rod, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. And he hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. See, now we see God hardened his heart. In the first meeting, he didn't. But now, in the rest of them, God does. So I think Pharaoh, he lost his chance when he rejected Moses' demands during that first meeting. And it even says before this in 7:1, God is speaking to Moses and says, "See, I have made thee a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet." See, Pharaoh rejected God. I don't know the Lord, and I don't want to have anything to do with him. Pharaoh can't believe in this God that he can't see, right? God's an invisible God. Or Egypt, they've got all their idols and statues and paintings and temples, the whole pantheon of gods they have there. Pharaoh can't believe in a God he can't see, and because he rejected God, now God has to almost bring in a God figure that Pharaoh can actually see. God says to Moses, "I'll make you a God to him." So now Moses dealing directly with Pharaoh is like in the place of God. So Pharaoh can see Moses and view him as a God because he won't see the true and invisible God. Let's see. We see that they did the signs here. He threw the staff down and it became a serpent, but unfortunately the Egyptian magicians were able to throw their rods down and they became serpents too. And they copied what Aaron had did. And isn't that just like the way it is today? There's churches today. They imitate true godliness, right? The scripture 2 Timothy 3:5 talks about people that have a form of godliness but deny the power thereof. How many churches are out there today that if you go, there's things that seem godly about them. Maybe they dress nice, or maybe they appear to have spiritual gifts. Maybe they have some sort of service, but it's totally lacking any true spiritual power. They're not truly saved. It's based on works, or they're just in it for the experience. So this has been going on for thousands of years, where people can, have a type of what appears to be godliness, but it's not true holiness. What's that? Yeah, Catholics, but even in the Baptist churches, think about like the hypocrisy that we see. How many churches that go into like legalism? You get into legalism and hypocrisy, where they dress real modest, and they've got all the standards, but yet inwardly, when they're not at church and they're at home, they're just living their typical wicked lives. It's like this form of godliness, imitating godliness when they're around other people, but there's really no true power behind it. And we see just a kind of a type of it here as we're looking for types and pictures in the Bible. That's kind of a type of false Christianity, false gifts, false power, but it's not true saving power. All right, which brings us to the 10 plagues, because it said Pharaoh didn't accept that, even after that sign with the serpent the staff becoming a serpent. Pharaoh didn't accept it. It said God hardened his heart and he rejected it, and especially after we saw the magicians that were able to copy it.
I think what's cool about that is that his one snake destroyed all the rest of the snakes.
Yeah.
Like ate them all.
Well, like we had saw when God first gave Moses the sign on the mountain of him throwing the staff down, like I said, Moses was a shepherd, lived in the fields, probably very used to snakes, but yet when this staff became a snake, he fled from it. Like it was a scary snake. I mean, he must have been really big or really fierce. And when he threw this down in front of Pharaoh, they must have, whether it was sleight of hand or whether they truly had some sort of demonic powers to conjure serpents or images of serpents.
But it's still like God's power still trumps whatever their power was.
Yeah.
And that should have been a sign for Pharaoh.
Right. Yeah, and again, just
that
like
power is stronger.
And as we've seen, I mean, we when we talked about the tribulation and the Antichrist and all that, we see Satan is just a copycat, copy, just always trying to imitate God, but never can completely do it. Just like here, they imitated God's power, but ultimately they failed, and God's power, had the authority over them. All right, so we get into, as God promised, there was going to be 10 plagues, and that he said that he was going to deliver them with a strong hand, and God was going to make his power be known. In the Bible, the number 10, it's a number that symbolizes like a completeness of something, like a complete set or a fullness of quantity. We have 10 commandments that we're given, and the 10 commandments are like a complete summary of like the moral law of God. Pharaoh changed his mind 10 times. Just some interesting things with numbers. 4 is the number of physical creation, and 6 is the number of man. So 10 plagues is almost like the 4 being the number of creation is actually going to be used to bring judgments against 6 man. 4 and 6 make 10. So there's 10 plagues, 4 and 6, the creation being used against man. I don't know, just some interesting numbering type stuff. So we have here, every time God does something incredible and amazing, it has to be criticized, right? Every time God does something, like God's greatest miracles have to be attacked and tried to be explained away or cause doubt to be on them in some way. I did that myself. So, I mean, think about it. I have a list there kind of like some things that God has done and then how Satan has attacked it. Obviously, like one of God's greatest demonstrations of power is in creation, right? Creating the heavens and the earth. And what does Satan and man try to do to explain it away? Evolution, billions and billions of years. I think we're up to like 40 billion years now. It started with like 10,000 years, and then 50,000 years, and then a few 100,000 years, and then millions and billions, and now it's like 40 billion years. And you throw that number out there, and anything can happen. But that's a way to try to explain what God did. And then we have like the flood. The flood, God's amazing judgment on the entire world, and a picture of what's to come. It's a warning to us living today in the end times. God judged the world before; He'll do it again. But the world doesn't want to believe that. They want to just say, it's just a story. It's just a myth. It's just something that just goes back as stories and myths and people's cultural histories. But even among Christians, even Christians start believing some of these lies. Like Christians may not jump on board with the flat-out evolution theory, but they'll believe maybe in some sort of a theistic evolution. Like maybe God did create things, but not completely, and they had to still kind of evolve somewhat, and God had to be involved a little bit to Yeah, I mean they want to try to we'll try to merge the two, creation and evolution. So the world says there was no flood. That's just ridiculous. Didn't happen. And even Christians kind of fall into it and say, well, maybe it was a local flood. Maybe it was just that area of the world that flooded or something like that. And they buy it. They try to merge the world's viewpoints with the Bible's viewpoints. Instead of just taking the Bible plainly, literally, and believing it for what it says, they want to try to explain things away. Isaac's sacrifice that we talked about, the greatest picture of Jesus laying his own life down willingly as a sacrifice. And they mockers will point at that and say, oh yeah, your God believes in child sacrifice. They'll try to twist it around into something negative. Or we've talked about the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea, another great miracle. And even Christians will be like, well, maybe it was just like the swampy part of the Red Sea. Maybe it wasn't the real deep part. Maybe they just went through the very tip where it was just kind of swampy and,
Pharaoh's army.
Yeah, and the entire army drowned in a swamp that was knee high, right? And then people obviously don't even want to believe that Jesus came in the flesh. That's one of the tests, to see whether a spirit is from God or not, is if they confess that Jesus has come in the flesh. And the world wants to deny that. They'll say, oh, he's just a wise man. He was just he wasn't like a, God himself. He was just he was a prophet, who understood things, but he really wasn't God. And this is just another area where the world wants to attack something that God did. The plagues were a huge testimony of God's power, and yet the world wants to try to attack that and explain them away. So, has anybody ever heard any explanations how people try to explain plagues away?
Like the bloody sea, how that.
Yeah, all this stuff.
Oh yeah, the iron or like the. You know how some bodies of water turn like a reddish color,
Like
you
the
got
iron deposit?
like
Yeah.
algae or.
Mhm. Yeah, this is a theory that was put forward by someone named Greta Holt in 1957. This is the Greta Holt theory. Age of Empires 2.
Love it.
Yeah, I had some fun with this. I did, yeah, and I'm going to explain what the world is, what they believe, and it's just sad because even Christians like buy into this instead of just believing the Bible. But this is what Greta Holt wrote in 1957. She wrote this whole paper that sounded very scientific and legitimate and technical and like Latin phrases, and it just like if you or I read this paper, we'd be like, wow. I mean, how do you argue with that? I mean, she uses Latin. I mean, you can't argue with Latin. I mean, it must be true, you know. And people get intimidated by it. But I'm going to go through this after we look at her theory, and as we go through the plagues, we'll talk about them, and we'll see if you just take your time and keep your faith in the Word of God and study things out, you don't have to be confused or afraid of the world and the kind of things that they're going to throw at you. So the Greta Holt theory goes something like this. Once upon a time in Egypt, there was a huge flood that came down, and the Nile became all flooded. And the flood brought down tons of red mud and red blooming algae. And we've heard things in the world called a red tide today. And so she says that, well, it was just a giant red tide. All this algae came and just bloomed like crazy during this flood, and caused the Nile to look like blood. And all this mud that came down, like was all churned up, and so it gave it a reddish color. So the Nile flooded, and the algae grew, turning it all red. The red algae bloom depleted the oxygen that was in the water and killed the fish. And fish, one of the things that fish like to eat in places like the Nile are frog eggs, right? Fish love to eat frog eggs. So with the frog eggs, without the fish eating the frog eggs, the frogs were able to completely multiply. So the frogs multiplied like crazy and started going up onto the land. As a natural occurrence of the algae and the fish dying and the frogs overpopulating and going up on the land. I had a little bit of fun with that animation. Right. So then the fish, which were all like dead in the Nile, developed anthrax and infected the frogs. And so these anthrax infected frogs came up on the land and contaminated the soil and caused the livestock to die. So that's why you have the plague of the cattle and the sheep and everything all dying. It's because they were infected by this anthrax that the frogs spread from the dead fish onto the land. And now with all these dead animals, there's a huge proliferation of biting insects because there's all these dead animals, all the flies, all these biting gnats are gonna like multiply like crazy, and now we get the plague of the flies. All very natural. This red plague comes down, kills the fish develop anthrax, give it to the overpopulated frogs who go up onto the land and contaminate the land, cause all the cattle to die, and because of that the flies multiply. And then all these biting flies and gnats spread this form of skin anthrax to the live animals and human beings, causing the plague of the boils. So it's just a natural, logical progression, one to another.
Do they have Egyptian like hieroglyphs of these like,
I don't know.
or like?
No, I'm not sure. I didn't look into that.
Record them
Yeah, I didn't look into
on their
that
walls.
part of it. All right, and then severe weather that brought the flood and the hail. And it's interesting that it says that the hail was mingled with fire. I don't know what kind of weather would bring fire or hail mingled with fire, maybe with just a lot of fire lightning or something, I don't know. But supposedly the severe weather that brought the flooding and brought the hail swept in this whole plague of locusts. And then all that mud and silt that had come down the Nile and had messed up the whole Nile dried out into like a really fine dust. And then a huge 3-day long sandstorm comes along and causes the 3 days of darkness that we see in the Bible. And then finally the whole, the most severe plague with the death of the firstborn, she claims is a translation error. That it wasn't the death of the firstborn, it was the death of the first fruits that died as a result of the plagues and the dust storms and the darkness. And that is pretty much her theory in a nutshell. And it all depends on the red plague, or the red algae. The red algae, this big red algae bloom, is like the core of her theory. It's the cornerstone that the rest of this whole theory is built on. And we'll take a look into it, just kind of compare it and see, if there's any kind of, does it stand up to any real scientific scrutiny?
What's interesting? She can say that last one was an error in translation. Why doesn't she just say the whole thing was an error and none of it's true? But they won't, because they have to be able to somehow twist it, and that's how you rob someone's belief.
You want to sound scientific about it.
Yeah.
That is my opinion.
Right. But scratch out the last one when it's a little too difficult.
Yeah, even though there's a whole bunch of other scriptures and the whole context is the death of the firstborn. I mean, it's just so obvious to the context and the rest of the scriptures. But yet she'll say it's just a translation error in that like one verse or whatever. But yet ignore the overwhelming evidence and everything else. What time do we got? I don't know what.
29.
Okay, you okay to?
Right.
Okay, are we okay to continue? Just want to make sure. I don't have. It's not like a ton more, but I don't want to push things too long. I've been trying to keep it a little bit shorter. But if it's 20 to 9, we're good. That can be done by 9. I'm just going to cover the first plague. All right, first plague. Water to blood. In Exodus 7:19-25, and the Lord spake unto Moses, say unto Aaron, take thy rod and stretch out thine hand upon the waters of Egypt, upon their streams, upon their rivers, and upon their ponds, and upon all their pools of water, that they may become blood, and that there may be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and vessels of stone. And Moses and Aaron did so, as the Lord commanded. And he lifted up the rod and smote the waters that were in the river in the sight of Pharaoh, and in the sight of his servants, and all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And the fish that was in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, neither did he hearken unto them, as the Lord had said. And Pharaoh turned and went into his house, neither did he set his heart to this also. And all the Egyptians dig round about the river for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the river. And 7 days were fulfilled after that the Lord had smitten the river. So we have the water being turned into blood. And water and blood, both are good things, right? They're both a blessing. They both give life and keep us alive, but they don't when they're not where they're supposed to be. If our blood's not in our bodies, we're not going to live. If water is not out in the atmosphere, if we get water in our bodies, that can cause us to die. Blood and water are good things, but when you've got blood mixing or replacing water, definitely not a good thing. So I mentioned the red algae is the core of this theory. Oh, one other thought. I wonder if it's kind of one of those, it's a poetic justice or irony. We know we read talked a couple weeks ago about Pharaoh was killing the babies, killing innocents. And if you remember what God said after Cain had killed Abel about his blood like crying from the ground. Almost wonder if this was like God announcing to Pharaoh that I'm going to hold you accountable. All the blood that you spilled through, killing all those babies and oppressing the Hebrew people, and probably many that have died as a result of their slavery, their blood cries out to me. Maybe this whole Nile to blood thing was like a picture that God was going to recompense them for the blood that they had shed against his people. And, we just read the Egyptians, and then they had to dig, right? It said they had to dig for water. It's kind of interesting because here the Egyptians had just forced the Hebrews to work even harder. I mean, they were slaves and servants, and Pharaoh made them work even harder. Well, now God actually turns it around, and now the Egyptians find themselves working harder. Now they've got to dig for the water. They can't just go and scoop up some water. Now they've actually got to put work into it. So this is where, instead of just believing the Bible, even Christians fall into this. So I don't know if anyone's heard the term hypernatural. We've heard the term supernatural, right? Like supernatural is just something that's just completely unexplainable, that just could not have happened without God, right? Supernatural. Well, Christians even will try to explain the plagues as some sort of a hypernatural thing, which means it's like natural, but God pushed it along or had something to do with it. So Christians, instead of just believing the Bible, and I can't even believe how many. I mean, just doing searches about the 10 plagues, Christian website after Christian website, like they all buy into this theory that it's a red tide, that it's a red algae that infected the Nile. And maybe it wasn't totally natural like it normally would have done, but like God had something to do with it. Like God used the red algae and just multiplied it like crazy to accomplish his purposes in Egypt. So they call it a hypernatural miracle, that it was something that occurred naturally, but God pushed it along and like gave his, little power to it to like have it accomplish something. Instead of just believing what the Bible says, that it was blood, they try to, again, they want to combine man's theories trying to explain things with the Bible, and they try to mix them. And so they got like, well, it could happen naturally, but with a little bit of God's help, instead of just being completely supernatural. So first thought about the algae that this woman, she specifically calls out 2 types of algae. And I think I'll have them pop up here, right? There's this Euglena sanguinea and Haemotococcus pluvialis. I don't know, see my Latin's real bad. But that's the algae that she specifically calls out caused the red tide. So if you look at that, it's not red, right? It's not. Some of them have like a little red spot in it. I don't know if I can get my laser pointer. These have like a kind of a little reddish eye or whatever, but overall, if you were to get like billions of those in a body of stagnant water, it would be green. Like we've seen swamps, we've seen stagnant pools of water, and algae is green when it's alive. Now, this algae, after it dies, it'll turn more red. But for the most part, if this is all coming down in a flood, and it's all churned up and everything, this would be very rich in oxygen, it would be very alive and healthy, and it would be very green, not red. This algae, those two algae, never, in 100 years of study, those two algae have never once been found in the Nile, let alone all of Africa. There's over 400 species of algae that have been studied in the Nile River, and over 1,000 or thousands of algae that have been discovered and studied like all throughout Africa, but yet not once ever have they found any sign of those two particular algae ever showing up anywhere in Africa. So these algae, they're actually very fragile. They die easy, and they actually need ice water. These algae live up in like North Europe and like Arctic regions. These algae, they wouldn't survive in the warm waters of the Nile in Africa. That's why they're never found there. These algae are very cold water algae. They couldn't survive. There's no way that this algae could be responsible for any kind of a red tide in the Nile River. It's green, it's super fragile. If it was in a big flood, it would never survive. And it needs very cold water to stay healthy. It's also safe to eat. It's FDA approved as a powerful antioxidant, cancer fighter, athletic performance booster. It's fine. So if these algae were responsible for the red, blood appearance of the Nile, what's the problem? They could have drank it and been stronger and been able to run faster and fought cancer at the same time. I mean, they're selling it in pills today, the exact same stuff. The fine print on there, maybe not on that side of the jar, but in one of the other pictures, it actually says the Latin name of that algae. I mean, they sell it. You can eat it. It's non-toxic. It's actually good for you, an antioxidant. So just another reason why those algae could have not been responsible in any way for the red tide, or for this red Nile, because it wouldn't have killed the fish, and it wouldn't have been a problem for the Egyptians to be able to drink it. There's also no way that algae could grow during a flood, because during a flood, the waters are very turbulent and they're just chopped up, and lots of air and oxygen and everything getting moved around, and the mud's all and the silt's all stirred up. And mud and silt are the enemies of algae. Algae, I mean, you've seen it. It has to be like a still, stagnant pond, and you see the algae floating on top. If it's a churning, turbulent water with a lot of mud, the mud and the silt actually clings to the algae and pulls them down to the bottom, and they die. The algae need to be up on top, floating there in a calm, still pool, so they can get the sunlight and live. But in a turbulent flood, they would just get pulled down by the mud and die. And the Bible also doesn't say anything about there being a flood of the Nile. It doesn't say anything that the Nile was overflowing its banks or was at a flood stage. It's just something that this Greta Holt just completely made up. That the Nile was flooded and came down with all this mud and with all this algae, but there's no biblical evidence of it. There's no proof, but it's just, it has to be that way to fit the rest of her whole theory in there.
Well, the Nile is also the water is moving, so it couldn't be stable.
Right. So
the Nile's always
so even if there was any chance of a red algae, being the cause of some sort of a redness in the water, it would have to be during a low tide. It would have to be during a low season. It wouldn't be a flood. It would have to be a very low time where the water is just stagnant and not moving very much. That's when algae grows. But yet she insists that it was a flooded Nile that was, bringing all this mud and algae down. Let's see. Bible never mentions flood, and check my notes. So during a flood, the Nile would be brown, right? Because it would be bringing mud. I think I got a picture. There we go. There's the Nile flooded. Doesn't look very red to me. That's a flooded Nile. It was a huge flood back, I don't know what the date is, but obviously it's very brown. When there's a flood, water just tends to be very churned up and choppy and very muddy and brown, not red. And another thing, if the Nile water was just algae or just mud that was making it that color, then all the Egyptians would have had to have done is take some of that Nile water out, put it in a pot, and let it sit. Right? They could have just put some water in a pot, let it sit in their counter overnight, and the mud would have like settled down to the bottom, and they could have just got the water off the top. Yeah, well, they would have just purified it. Right? If it was just algae, it would have just settled out. You could have just taken some water, let it sit, and would just naturally settle to the bottom. And just the fact that it appeared instantly, this is where they want to say it's a hypernatural miracle. Whereas Greta Holt wants to say it was this natural occurrence where this flood came and the algae grew, but the Bible says it happened instantly. As soon as he hit the water, the algae was just instantly, or the blood of water turned to blood everywhere instantly. And there's another thought, like if the water was like truly blood, then was it something with they want to argue saying that if the water was really blood, you couldn't dig because like the dirt, the sand wouldn't filter the blood. If it was really blood, you wouldn't be able to dig holes and get water out. But I think if you dug a hole that wasn't near the Nile, it's not Nile water. The Nile turned to blood, but I think it's God's mercy. He didn't turn the entire water table underground into blood. So you dig into the ground, it's not a matter of filtering it from the Nile. It's like you're getting into the fresh water. Like that's the only water that God didn't allow to turn to blood, was if you actually dug and got the water up. But that water doesn't have to be connected to the Nile. But that's just another argument that they use. Well, if the Nile was really blood, you wouldn't be able to dig a hole because the sand wouldn't filter the water from the Nile and get the blood out and just give you water. But not if you just dig low enough to get the water table that wasn't turned into blood. Let's see. And the fact that it affected water outside the Nile, right? If it was algae, a red tide, how is it that water that was in people's pots in their house turned into blood too? How did the red algae just suddenly appear in every pond, every pool, well, every vessel of water in people's houses, right? It appeared that way all over Egypt, not just the Nile. So again, just this whole theory with this algae is just ridiculous. I mentioned about the digging wouldn't have filtered it. It wasn't a matter of filtering it. It was a matter of just getting down to the water table. And there's no scientific evidence to back up this lame attack. She likes to throw around these Latin terms. I showed you the names of the bacteria, and it's a very technical sounding paper, and Christians get nervous about that. We get nervous when somebody who's supposedly smart wants to throw things at us. And instead of just clinging to the Bible is true, the Bible is right, it says what it says, we get tempted to be like, well, I mean, maybe there is something to that. Maybe there is something kind of natural, and it wasn't just all God. Maybe it was God and nature. And it's like, no, we got to be steadfast. We need to hold to the Bible as the final word. The Bible is true, every word of it. We need to take it as literally as possible without trying to explain it away in ways that can kind of appease the world. So even if somebody really smart and scientific sounding, I mean, as scientific sounding as she is, this Greta Holt, if you actually look into the evidence, like bit by bit that she claims, it's just impossible. But yet people don't want to take the time and dig into that, and they just get intimidated and say, they kind of compromise then and say, well, maybe it's a little bit of both. So the magicians copied it. They made water appear to turn into blood themselves, and it's too bad they weren't able to clean it up, or anything. I mean, if it was just algae, they could have filtered water if it was just algae. They couldn't. They could make more water into blood, but they couldn't make clean water from the bloody water. And that lasted 7 days. So they had to dig for water. for 7 days. And Pharaoh wasn't impressed. When we read that, it just says he just kind of went into his house. And that's another thing. People, when they try to reason, with their human brains, they're like, well, and think about this for an argument. One of the arguments is, if that was really literally blood, wouldn't the people have been like completely freaked out, right? Like if somebody turned a river in the United States to blood, people would be like absolutely like going crazy. And because he didn't, he just, ignored it and went in his house. It couldn't have been blood. It couldn't have been literally blood, or the people would have been like going crazy. But maybe if us today, in our bloodless, clean, white packaged meat at the supermarket culture, were to see like a river of blood, we'd be like really turned off by it and maybe it's made sick or whatever. But we're talking about an ancient culture that's used to all kinds of animal sacrifices and bloody, violent wars where they're poking each other with swords and spears and used to seeing blood and guts and stuff all the time. So it may have been shocking to see the Nile turned into blood, but overall, it wasn't, it's just a lame argument to say, like, well, they would have been more upset if it was really blood. Well, no, they're different people. You'd be upset if you saw a river of blood, but obviously Pharaoh and people living in that culture back then weren't. And finally, as we look into all of these plagues, you'll see that each plague, 10 plagues, actually focused on one of the gods that Egypt worshipped. And in this case, there was the Egyptian god Hapi, who is the god of the Nile, the one who's in charge of keeping the Nile healthy and providing all the clean water for people. And by doing this, God essentially completely disgraced their god, saying he doesn't have any power. He can't protect you. God's the one who's in control. I think another thought on the Nile and the red algae was, if the Nile was super muddy, it would block the sunlight, and that would actually cause the algae to not be able to grow, because the algae needs to kind of float on the top and get the sunlight. But if it's all churned up and all muddy, so you can't have the mud together with the algae, because it would block the sunlight, and it would the algae would just die. And I think another thing was, she says that the algae killed all the oxygen in the water, which took all the oxygen, which killed the fish. But typically when there's a lot of algae, it's a plant. It makes oxygen. Typically when there's a lot of algae around, it actually increases the oxygen that's in the water, which goes against your theory. And on top of it, it would have been like she said it was during a flood. If it was all churned up and during a flood season, the water would be completely rich in oxygen. That's the whole point. One of the best places to go fishing are like where there's rapids and stuff, because there's a lot of churning and motion that gets the oxygen into the water, and it makes the fish actually healthier and stronger. So I think, I don't remember if there's anything else about the algae, but just there's so much, and her whole theory that tries to explain this away as some sort of a natural phenomenon, even if it was helped by God. It all depends on this presumption that the Nile flooded, which there's no proof or evidence for. There's nothing in the Bible about it. And this presumption that it was algae that came and caused the Nile to appear red. And just looking at the evidence that we've looked at just proves that it's impossible. It couldn't have happened. And without that, the rest of her theory just falls apart. And as we get into looking at some of these other plagues as we go through, we'll kind of see how it just doesn't line up with any kind of explanation, with any kind of natural phenomenon. So I think Happy has to change his name to Sad now that he got defeated by God. So that's it.